Hey dude, ever tried going a few days without a shower? Now imagine doing that for months, in the freezing wilds of Canada, with no soap, no clean clothes, just wet boots, smoke-covered skin, and a cold wind that never let up. Tonight we're stepping into the worn-out shoes of the early fur traders, the guys who carved paths through untouched forests, paddled rivers for weeks straight, and smelled like smoke, sweat, and animal fat the entire time. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, it was lonely, exhausting, and honestly kind of brutal, but somehow they kept going. And the way they survived physically, mentally, and emotionally tells you more about human grit than most history books ever will. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe if this kind of raw, quiet history helps you wind down. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time your eyes started getting heavy. So yeah, dim the lights, get under that blanket. If you've got someone next to you, give him a lazy little hug. If not, that's cool too. I'm alone tonight just like you. Now take a breath, let it out slow, and let's drift back in time to a silent, frozen world where survival meant something different and the smell, well, let's just say it stuck around. In the early days of the Canadian fur trade, fur traders, most notably those working for the Hudson's Bay Company, found themselves living in some of the most remote and unforgiving environments on Earth. The temperatures often plunged far below freezing, and the vast, untamed wilderness offered few comforts. For many, the idea of basic hygiene was a distant concern when survival was at the forefront of their minds. In this harsh world, the absence of soap is particularly striking. Today, we often take for granted the ability to wash our hands, our bodies, and our clothes. But in the isolated fur trading posts along the shores of Hudson Bay, soap was a rare luxury. The fur traders had to rely on whatever they could find to maintain their hygiene. Animal fats were often used, but these would have been crude and far from effective. So how did they survive the winter months without the basic comforts of modern hygiene? The first winter arrived harshly for these men. With little to no access to fresh water, a lack of soap, and no way to clean their clothing, they had to devise other methods of staying somewhat clean. Their primary focus was on warmth, food, and safety, leaving personal hygiene to become an afterthought. However, the fur traders were nothing if not resourceful. They learned that using boiled herbs and heated water helped clean wounds and could even alleviate the discomfort of prolonged exposure to the elements. At times, their hygiene practices became as simple as using snow to scrub their faces, hands, and bodies. It was not a method that could prevent disease or stave off body odor, but it was the best they had. As the winter months dragged on, the fur traders faced more serious challenges. The isolation meant that they were vulnerable to illnesses that spread rapidly in these confined, close-knit communities. Without soap, the chances of infection increased, and illnesses such as scurvy and tuberculosis claimed the lives of many who lived in these remote trading posts. Was this their greatest challenge, the lack of cleanliness in an unforgiving climate? But how did the Hudson's Bay Company adapt to these challenges over time? Would they develop more effective means of hygiene, or would they rely on indigenous knowledge and methods to survive these difficult winters? As we move forward into Section 2, we will delve deeper into how these traders' lives evolved amidst their daily struggle for survival in an environment that was both beautiful and brutal. The hygiene of the Hudson Bay, how fur traders endured harsh winters without soap. As the first winter in Hudson Bay wore on, the fur traders' ingenuity began to shine. They were isolated from the comforts of civilization, but they were not isolated from the harsh lessons that the land itself had to offer. In the absence of soap, they relied on what little knowledge they had of local plants and natural remedies, and they adapted to the environment in unexpected ways. Local indigenous communities who had lived off the land for generations proved to be invaluable sources of knowledge. The traders learned from the indigenous people how to use the bark of certain trees, like the birch, for medicinal purposes. They also discovered that certain wild plants could be used to soothe rashes, treat minor wounds, and even combat the spread of lice and other pests. These herbal remedies, although not a substitute for soap, allowed the fur traders to cope with the limited hygiene resources available to them. But despite these adaptations, the lack of soap and proper hygiene continued to be a significant issue. The settlers began to understand the limits of what their new environment could provide. While some traders found ways to clean themselves with snow or boiling water, others used the more readily available resources, animal fats, plant oils, and even ash, to try to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. These methods were often ineffective and left the traders with a constant sense of discomfort. They were far from the cleanliness standards we expect today, but in their world, these small rituals helped them hold on to some semblance of normalcy. As the months passed and the next trading season approached, the traders found themselves facing a different challenge: disease. The same close quarters that had helped them survive the winter months were now contributing to the spread of illness. With no access to proper medical care and limited hygiene practices, diseases such as scurvy, influenza, and tuberculosis began to take their toll. Yet, through it all, the traders showed remarkable resilience. They relied on their knowledge of local plants to try and stave off disease, and they continued to push forward despite the discomforts of their living conditions. In this dire situation, the traders also began to see how interconnected their survival was with the environment around them. Their relationships with indigenous communities grew deeper as they exchanged not just goods, but knowledge about survival in the wilderness. The first inklings of cooperation between cultures, born out of necessity, began to take root. Was this the beginning of a relationship that would define much of Canada's history? Comes to a close, we are left with questions. How did the traders begin to adapt to the full scale of their surroundings? Did their reliance on indigenous knowledge prove to be their saving grace, or did it lead to unintended consequences? And most importantly, did the traders ever find a way to make life more comfortable, more hygienic in their harsh world? These questions will lead us into the final section of this story. The hygiene of the Hudson Bay, how fur traders survived harsh winters without soap. As the fur traders entered the final years of their time in Hudson Bay, they had grown accustomed to the discomforts and challenges of life without soap. Yet, through sheer will and necessity, they found ways to make do with what they had, even as they faced some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Their survival was never guaranteed, but the fur traders' determination and adaptability allowed them to forge ahead, learning more about their environment and about themselves every day. The arrival of spring brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. The thawing rivers and lakes brought with them fresh supplies, both of food and of tools, as trading ships arrived with much-needed provisions. For the first time in months, the traders could access fresh fruit and vegetables, which helped to combat scurvy and other diseases. But despite the fresh supplies, the legacy of winter lingered. The traders, now well versed in surviving without soap, continued their reliance on animal fats, plant oils, and local remedies to maintain their hygiene. Yet, there was a realization that began to set in. The survival skills they had acquired had become ingrained in their lives. It wasn't just the lack of soap that had defined them, it was the understanding of how to endure. But while their strategies for survival were effective, they were never truly ideal. The discomfort of being covered in animal grease and soot was a constant reminder of the trade-offs they had to make in order to survive. These methods did little to mitigate the long-term effects of hygiene neglect. The toll it took on their health, though often invisible at first, would catch up to many. Years of exposure to the elements, combined with poor hygiene, resulted in chronic illnesses and the eventual breakdown of health in many of the traders. As their relationships with indigenous communities deepened, they learned even more sophisticated ways to deal with the challenges of hygiene. Through trade, the traders began to acquire more materials, such as better fabrics for clothing, and even early soap substitutes made from ash and animal fats. It wasn't soap in the modern sense, but it was an improvement. The role of soap, however, would remain a symbol of the gulf between what they had to endure and the comforts of modern life that seemed so distant. And so, after years of hardship, the Hudson's Bay Company slowly adapted to these realities. Hygiene, although still rudimentary by today's standards, became a greater priority. As the fur trade continued, so too did the learning curve of those who worked within it. Their survival depended not just on the furs they traded, but on their ability to adapt to the land and the resources it offered. Over time, the trading posts saw more advanced sanitation methods, though they would never fully overcome the challenges of their environment. Yet, they managed, always one step ahead of the wilderness, always surviving in a world that demanded everything from them. Looking back, it is clear that the fur traders' ability to endure was not just about the physical challenges they faced, it was about their resilience in the face of hardship. The absence of soap, though a small part of the story, becomes a lens through which we can understand the determination, adaptation, and survival of these men and women. It was not just about cleanliness, but about survival in a world that was not kind. The legacy of these fur traders and their relationship with both the land and the indigenous people helped shape the history of Canada in ways we continue to see today. The fur trade wasn't just about furs. It was about the survival of a community that learned to thrive in the harshest conditions. Their stories are those of resilience, of learning, of adaptation. They remind us that even in the most difficult times, humans have the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find ways to survive. And with that, we close the story of the Hudson Bay fur traders, struggles and survival. But as we reflect on their history, we are left with a thought. How many other stories like this one exist, hidden in the overlooked details of history? The lives of these traders, though considered boring or insignificant by some, are the very foundation of the Canadian story, shaping the nation we know today. Voyageurs' life on the move, surviving the Canadian wilderness with limited supplies. The Canadian wilderness, vast and wild, became the home and the battleground for the voyageurs who worked within the fur trade system. These French-Canadian paddlers, with their brightly painted canoes, played a crucial role in the fur trade, navigating treacherous rivers and lakes to deliver furs from remote trading posts to more populated areas, and vice versa. For the voyageurs, survival was an ever-present challenge. They were tasked with traveling thousands of miles through rugged terrain, with only basic supplies and an unwavering need to endure. The journey was long and exhausting. These men faced days on end in canoes, paddling through choppy waters, battling the ever-changing weather, and relying on limited provisions. The voyageurs' survival depended on their skill and ingenuity, as they faced not only the dangers of the natural world but the realities of limited supplies. They could not afford to carry extra weight, so everything they took had to be carefully chosen. The foods they carried were often dried and salted, basic items like salted pork, dried fish, and hard biscuits, all of which could last for months without spoiling. Yet this limited diet took a toll. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, was rampant among the voyageurs, as fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce in the wilderness. The voyageurs, even in their vital role, were not immune to the harsh realities of the land. Their bodies, overworked and undernourished, often paid the price for their arduous journey. Despite the challenges of their diets and the risks they faced on the journey, the voyageurs had a singular focus: the completion of their task. Their lives were governed by the rhythm of the canoe, the beat of the paddles, and the sounds of the wilderness around them. Every river they navigated, every portage they crossed, was a testament to their endurance and adaptability. But their lives were not without struggle. How did they survive not only the physical demands of paddling, but also the mental strain of being separated from civilization for so long? Their lives were punctuated by moments of camaraderie around campfires, where they shared stories of their journeys, sang songs, and found solace in one another's company. Yet, these fleeting moments of rest could not mask the underlying tension of their lives: survival. Their knowledge of the land was both practical and spiritual, as they learned to read the signs of nature and make do with what little they had. But was it enough? In this first section of the story, we begin to grasp the weight of the voyageurs' existence. Their ability to adapt to the wilderness, endure long periods of isolation, and thrive in an environment that was as unforgiving as it was beautiful is a feat that demands admiration. However, we are left with questions about their daily lives. How did these voyageurs handle the emotional toll of isolation, and what kept them going in the face of such relentless hardship? We will explore the psychological endurance of the voyageurs, how they coped with the mental strain of their journey, and what drove them to keep paddling forward, day after day, under impossible circumstances. Voyageurs' life on the move, surviving the Canadian wilderness with limited supplies. The life of a voyageur was a delicate balance between the physical challenges of the Canadian wilderness and the psychological strain of isolation and monotony. As the voyageurs paddled along the rivers, enduring the harsh weather and the limited supplies that sustained them, they learned to rely on more than just their physical strength. The mental resilience required to continue on these treacherous journeys was perhaps even more demanding than the physical labor of paddling for hours on end. The voyageurs would often spend months at a time away from their families and the comforts of home. The days blurred together in a haze of repetitive work and survival. The weight of isolation took its toll. Many voyageurs faced mental exhaustion, loneliness, and depression. The closest thing they had to a home was the campfire at the end of a long day, where they would gather in small groups to share a meal, a drink, and sometimes a song or story to pass the time. This camaraderie was essential. It was not just a way to break the silence of the wilderness, but a lifeline for the voyageurs, helping them maintain their sanity in a world that could be overwhelmingly bleak. However, despite the solidarity found around the fire, isolation was a constant companion. The voyageurs spent much of their time away from family and community, sometimes for years at a stretch. The long periods spent in such close proximity with other voyageurs, and the lack of any real privacy, could create tensions. Their relationships with one another were complex, shifting between comradeship and rivalry. This psychological stress, paired with the ever-present dangers of the wilderness, created a unique and often difficult mental environment. Even with these challenges, the voyageurs developed survival strategies that went beyond the physical. They learned how to handle stress, fatigue, and the emotional toll of the journey. Their songs, which were sung around the campfire after long days of paddling, served not only as a form of entertainment, but also as a means of coping. These songs told stories of their hardships, their long journeys, and the love they had for their distant homes. By singing, they kept alive the memory of the world they left behind, offering a form of escape from their grim reality. But how did the voyageurs manage to deal with the lack of communication with their families? How did they sustain their spirits during the long, silent stretches of the journey, where the only sound was the rhythmic splash of paddles in the water? What mental fortitude did it take to endure the constant uncertainty, knowing that the dangers of the wilderness could strike at any moment? And how did they maintain a sense of purpose when every day felt like a repeat of the last, spent merely moving from one destination to the next? The mental endurance of the voyageurs has become just as important as their physical strength. Their ability to face the grueling repetition of their lives, isolated in a harsh and unforgiving landscape, speaks to a resilience few today could comprehend. But we must ask, were these men truly just surviving, or were they, in their own way, thriving? What were the deeper, unspoken reasons that kept them moving, despite everything they faced? Voyageurs' life on the move, surviving the Canadian wilderness with limited supplies. As the final stretch of their journey neared, the voyageurs' lives were shaped by the sense of purpose that continued to drive them forward, despite the hardships they endured. Every day, they paddled with a singular focus: to complete the mission they had been entrusted with. But as the years wore on, it became clear that there was more than just survival at play. The voyageurs were not only fighting the elements and their limited provisions, they were fighting for something deeper, a sense of legacy, identity, and community. For many voyageurs, the fur trade was more than just a job. It was a way of life. It provided them with an identity that tied them not just to the fur trade itself, but to a broader cultural and national narrative. The voyageurs were part of the fabric that helped shape early Canadian history. Their role in the fur trade made them the link between indigenous communities and European settlers, and their influence extended far beyond the wilderness they navigated. This sense of purpose, of being part of something much larger than themselves, was crucial to their survival. Yet, as with all things, the fur trade eventually changed. The arrival of more modern forms of transportation, such as steamships and railroads, slowly rendered the voyageurs' role obsolete. But even as their traditional way of life faded, their legacy remained. The voyageurs' ability to navigate the Canadian wilderness, their resilience in the face of isolation and hardship, and their adaptability to the changing environment were qualities that lived on, shaping future generations. What was it that drove them forward all those years, year after year? Was it just the promise of trade, of furs, or was it something deeper? Did they believe in the mission they were part of, one that helped create Canada as we know it today? These questions linger as we reflect on the men who became the heartbeat of an early Canadian economy, yet often lived lives of relative obscurity. As we consider the end of the voyageurs' era, it becomes clear that their story is not just one of survival. It is a story of endurance, of finding meaning and identity in the face of seemingly endless hardship. Their legacy is etched in the landscapes they traversed, the stories they left behind, and the culture they helped to forge. They were more than just fur traders. They were pioneers in an untamed land, carving out a place for themselves and for future generations. And as we close this chapter, we are left with a final thought. What lessons can we draw from their lives, from their perseverance in the face of endless adversity? The voyageurs faced the unknown, and they thrived in the face of it. Can we, too, find meaning in our challenges and carry on, paddling forward into the unknown, no matter the obstacles in our way? The silent entrepreneurs, the business of fur trading in cold, remote Canada. In the early days of Canada's fur trade, it wasn't just the explorers, voyageurs, and indigenous people who shaped the course of history. It was the entrepreneurs who built the business infrastructure that made the fur trade possible. Behind the scenes, away from the rugged wilderness, a network of business-minded individuals operated the hubs that connected the fur trade to the broader world. These silent entrepreneurs were the merchants, financiers, and company men who orchestrated the vast trade of beaver pelts and other furs, shaping Canada's economic future. One of the most notable players in this economic game was the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, established in 1670. Initially, the company was a modest venture, but it would grow to dominate the fur trade in Canada for nearly 2 centuries. Behind the grandiose company logo and the title of Royal Charter, a different, quieter world existed. The HBC's business leaders worked from London, far from the harsh realities of the Canadian wilderness. They relied on a network of agents, managers, and local partners who executed the day-to-day business of the fur trade. It was this administrative infrastructure that allowed the HBC to grow into the economic powerhouse it became. But the HBC was not the only company at play. The Northwest Company, NWC, founded in 1779, was its main competitor. The NWC's leaders, many of whom were also entrepreneurs, sought to create their own network of trade, fighting fiercely for control of the fur-rich territories. Though the HBC was the larger and more powerful of the two, the NWC's tenacity and aggressive expansion helped it build an extensive network of trading posts in the wilderness. These competing forces, the HBC and the NWC, played a crucial role in shaping the Canadian fur trade economy, But their true success lay in their ability to maintain logistical control, adapt to changing circumstances, and make calculated business decisions. These men, often seen as mere investors or directors in history, were the true architects of the fur trade's success. They had to navigate complex political dynamics, manage vast amounts of capital, and deal with the unpredictability of the fur market. Their businesses were subject to the whims of weather, changing animal populations, and fluctuating demands for furs in Europe. But it was not just these practical concerns that shaped their decisions. It was the relationships they fostered with the indigenous people, the voyageurs, and the other players in the fur trade. As we think about these entrepreneurs, we realize that their lives were far removed from the excitement of the canoe journeys and the bustling trading posts. They operated in boardrooms, making decisions based on maps, letters, and reports from their agents. Their power, while hidden from the public eye, was immense. But what motivated them? Was it merely profit, or was there something more? A sense of empire, of building something enduring that would leave a mark on history. We've begun to uncover the world of the fur trade entrepreneurs, silent, powerful figures whose influence shaped not just an industry, but an entire country. But as we dig deeper into their story, we must ask, what drove these men? Was it just the desire for wealth, or did they see themselves as part of something larger, helping to carve out Canada's identity? And how did their decisions, often made in the comfort of distant offices, impact the lives of those in the harsh wilderness? The silent entrepreneurs, the business of fur trading in cold, remote Canada. As the fur trade economy evolved, the entrepreneurs who led these companies had to adapt to both local and international pressures. In the offices of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, it was not only about the transaction of furs. It was about managing relationships with indigenous communities, creating alliances, and navigating the politics of European powers who controlled the fur-rich regions of North America. The fur trade entrepreneurs understood the importance of their relationship with the indigenous peoples who acted as middlemen, guides, and, often, suppliers of furs. These partnerships were essential to the survival of the fur trade, and both the HBC and NWC relied heavily on the knowledge and expertise of indigenous traders. But these relationships were not always harmonious or equitable. The European traders, despite their dependence on indigenous knowledge and resources, often saw themselves as superior and sought to control the trade. As a result, tensions between the two groups were common, and these tensions could spill over into violence, especially as the fur trade companies jockeyed for territory and control. One of the most significant developments in the fur trade business came from the increasing demand for beaver pelts in Europe. Beaver fur was essential for making felt hats, a fashion staple in Europe, particularly in Britain and France. The demand for this commodity fueled the expansion of the fur trade, prompting entrepreneurs to look for new territories, better trading routes, and improved methods of managing the workforce. To meet the growing demand, the fur companies began to expand their operations, building new trading posts across Canada, reaching farther into the wilderness than ever before. However, the entrepreneurs who led these companies also had to contend with the unpredictability of nature. The business was risky, with no guarantee that the furs would fetch a high price or that the weather would cooperate. The companies had to make decisions based on incomplete information. They relied on their agents in the field to provide updates on fur quality, supply, and demand, but these reports could be slow and unreliable. The entrepreneurs were forced to make business decisions based on a mix of market analysis, gut instinct, and a dose of luck. One such entrepreneur was Sir John Henry Pelly, who became governor of the Hudson's Bay Company in the early 19th century. Pelly was instrumental in expanding the company's operations, overseeing significant growth in both its trading posts and its reach. Under his leadership, the HBC became more structured, incorporating advancements in logistics, communication, and financial management. Yet, despite these innovations, Pelly and his colleagues in the company faced constant challenges. They were forced to navigate the complicated politics of the fur trade, which involved not only competing with the NWC, but also dealing with the shifting loyalties of indigenous groups and European powers who sought to control the fur-rich lands. These entrepreneurs were not just businessmen, they were empire builders, shaping Canada's economic and political landscape. Yet, their power was largely invisible to the world. While they made significant decisions about trade routes, profits, and business strategies, their everyday lives were lived behind the scenes, far removed from the hard work of the voyageurs or the political maneuvering of government officials. They were, in many ways, the silent force that made the fur trade economy function, even as they played their part in the complex dance of power and profit that defined the era. But what did it cost? The growing expansion of the fur trade came with consequences. The entrepreneurs' focus on profits and expansion led to the overexploitation of the fur-bearing animals, particularly the beaver. By the mid-19th century, beaver populations had begun to decline rapidly, signaling that the once thriving fur trade would eventually run out of its most profitable commodity. The entrepreneurs of the fur trade had unknowingly set the stage for their own downfall by not recognizing the environmental limits of the land. We see the complexities of the fur trade business, driven by entrepreneurs who sought to control and expand an empire of commerce. These men were not merely motivated by wealth. They were driven by the challenge of managing vast networks, keeping their companies competitive and creating lasting legacies. However, the cost of their pursuit was not just financial. It was environmental, political, and cultural. We must ask, how did these entrepreneurs' ambitions impact the world around them? What long-term consequences did their actions have on the indigenous communities, the wildlife, and the land? And most importantly, how did the fur trade in the end shape the future of Canada? The silent entrepreneurs, the business of fur trading in cold, remote Canada. By the mid-19th century, the fur trade was facing a changing landscape. The entrepreneurs who had once thrived on the beaver pelts that dominated the market found themselves confronting unforeseen challenges. The most pressing of these was the environmental depletion of beaver populations. Overtrapping, a consequence of the insatiable European demand for beaver fur, had left the once bountiful waterways of Canada devoid of their primary commodity. In response to this decline, the fur trade companies, particularly the Hudson's Bay Company, were forced to adapt. The companies began to diversify their operations, exploring new commodities like timber, fish, and agricultural products to maintain their economic relevance. This shift marked a turning point in the fur trade, as the once dominant business of furs gave way to new forms of industry. Yet, the fur trade companies were not able to pivot quickly enough to sustain their once uncontested dominance over Canada's economy. The competition from American companies, such as the American Fur Company, was growing, and the increasing dominance of railways and steamships made the fur trade system less viable in the face of more modernized forms of transportation and commerce. This was a time of transition, both for the business and for the entrepreneurs who had built their lives around it. The end of the fur trade's golden age did not come suddenly. Instead, it was a slow and gradual decline, marked by the fatting influence of the men who had once controlled the vast expanse of fur-rich land. Sir George Simpson, the long-serving governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, was one of the final leaders to oversee the company's operations in the fur trade. Under his leadership, the company faced significant losses, and many of its trading posts were abandoned or sold. The last significant fur trading post, Fort William, closed in 1871, marking the end of an era for both the company and the entrepreneurs who had built their fortunes on it. The decline of the fur trade was a bittersweet moment for the entrepreneurs who had once dominated the Canadian landscape. They had built their legacies on a commodity that had shaped the country's early economy. But as the fur trade receded into history, These entrepreneurs faced the challenge of redefining their place in a rapidly changing world. Some, like Sir John Henry Pelly, saw their power and influence wane as the company's interests diversified, while others, like George Simpson, watched as their company's stronghold on Canadian trade was lost to new economic forces. But what was the true cost of this transition? The decline of the fur trade left behind a complex legacy, one that intertwined the fates of the entrepreneurs, the indigenous communities they had relied on, and the land itself. For the indigenous peoples, the fur trade had been both a source of economic opportunity and a devastating force that reshaped their way of life. The entrepreneurs who had come to rely on indigenous labor and knowledge often failed to understand the true consequences of their business practices. As beaver populations dwindled, the very foundations of the fur trade's success began to crumble. Yet despite these challenges, the legacy of the fur trade entrepreneurs lives on. The infrastructure they built, whether it was the trading posts, the waterways, or the business networks, laid the foundation for future generations. Their ability to navigate the complexities of business, to adapt to changing markets, and to engage with indigenous communities in both beneficial and damaging ways played a central role in the creation of Canada's economic and political landscape. As we close the story of these silent entrepreneurs, we are left with one final thought. How does their legacy continue to shape Canada today? The fur trade may have been the lifeblood of early Canadian commerce, but the entrepreneurs behind it were the architects of an economic system that would give birth to a nation. Their ambitions, successes, and failures all played a part in the story of Canada and in the story of the land they helped to shape. Navigating unseen waters the role of canoes in the fur trade. The canoe, often seen as a simple vessel of transportation, was one of the most vital tools in the fur trade. It was not just a means of crossing rivers or lakes. It was the lifeline that connected the fur trade networks, cutting through the vast, dense forests of Canada and reaching the farthest corners of the continent. To the voyageurs, the canoe was more than just a boat. It was a symbol of survival and efficiency in the wilderness. It was an instrument of both commerce and culture, carrying traders, furs, and goods across the rugged and often treacherous landscape. The canoes used by the voyageurs were built for one purpose: to transport goods and people efficiently over long distances. These canoes, often crafted from birch bark, were remarkably lightweight and durable, designed to handle the unpredictable waters of the Canadian wilderness. With the ability to carry a substantial load while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for navigating the swift currents of rivers, the canoe was unparalleled in its utility. The construction of these canoes was an intricate process, relying on the skills of indigenous artisans who passed down their knowledge through generations. The voyageurs, many of whom were of French-Canadian descent, learned the craft of canoe building from the indigenous peoples they worked alongside. This partnership was essential, as the voyageurs depended on these canoes to transport everything from furs to supplies, traversing vast distances in pursuit of trade. The birch bark, gathered in late summer when the trees were at their peak, was carefully peeled and sewn together using spruce roots to form the hull. The frame was made from spruce, pine, or cedar, which was strong yet flexible, capable of withstanding the rigors of the waterways. But the canoe was more than just a tool. It was also a way of life. The voyageurs spent days, weeks, and months in these canoes, traveling through the Canadian wilderness on a continuous journey. Canoeing became second nature to the men who lived and worked on the waters. Each stroke of the paddle was a rhythm that connected them to the land, the water, and the people who made this life possible. They became expert paddlers, learning to navigate the rivers, lakes, and rapids with precision and skill. For the voyageurs, the canoe was also a symbol of the endurance required to survive in the wilderness. Each journey was fraught with danger. The cold waters of the rivers, the ever-changing weather, and the constant threat of storms made the journey perilous. But the voyageurs persisted, relying on their canoes to carry them through the elements. They would paddle for hours, sometimes days on end, often without seeing another soul. It was a life of constant motion, moving from one trading post to another, across rivers and through forests, where their only companions were the sound of their paddles and the vast wilderness surrounding them. As we consider the importance of the canoe in the fur trade, we begin to appreciate how much more it represented than just a tool of transport. It was the symbol of the voyageur's lifestyle, one defined by endurance, resilience, and a deep connection to the land. But as we reflect on the canoes and the voyageurs who relied on them, we must ask, how did the canoe shape the way the fur trade developed? Did it allow for the rapid expansion of trade across Canada? And did it influence the ways the fur companies and indigenous peoples interacted with one another? We've seen how vital the canoe was to the fur trade and the survival of the voyageurs. Yet, there are still questions to explore. What role did these canoes play in the larger political and economic landscape of Canada? Were they responsible for more than just transporting goods? And did they serve as a symbol of a greater cultural exchange between European settlers and indigenous peoples? We will delve deeper into the intricacies of how the canoe not only shaped the fur trade, but also influenced the cultural and economic relationships in the region. Navigating unseen waters, the role of canoes in the fur trade. The canoe, though essential for transportation, also played a pivotal role in shaping the cultural and economic dynamics of the fur trade. As the voyageurs paddled their way across the vast expanse of Canada's rivers and lakes, the canoe became the symbol of a growing network that connected European settlers, indigenous peoples, and the land itself. The fur trade, at its core, was built upon the cooperation between these groups, and the canoe was one of the tools that made this collaboration possible. The canoes allowed for the fur trade to spread across territories that were otherwise inaccessible by traditional European methods of travel. Canoes were able to navigate narrow rivers, deep forests, and even shallow streams, making them the ideal transportation for a landscape that was far more complex than the open roads of Europe. These waterways, which served as the highways of Canada, allowed fur traders to connect distant outposts, facilitating trade from the interior to the more populated settlements along the coast. It was the canoe that carried the wealth of the fur trade, delivering pelts to markets, bringing goods and supplies to remote communities, and creating the trade routes that spanned the length of the continent. But the canoe also served as a vital link between European settlers and indigenous communities. The indigenous peoples, who had been traveling the rivers and lakes of Canada for thousands of years, shared their knowledge of the waterways with the French-Canadian voyageurs. The voyageurs, in turn, taught the indigenous peoples the techniques of European-style canoe construction and navigation, blending the two cultures in a way that made both more adaptable and resilient in the face of their respective challenges. The canoe became a symbol of this exchange, an object that held the wisdom of both cultures, crafted through collaboration and shared survival in the harsh Canadian wilderness. The waterways that the canoe traversed were not just physical spaces, they were also economic corridors. The rivers and lakes were the lifeblood of the fur trade, and the canoe was the vehicle that carried the commerce of a growing economy. Yet, this economy was not without conflict. As the fur trade expanded, so too did the competition between the fur companies. The Hudson's Bay Company, with its established network of trading posts and established relationships with indigenous peoples, clashed with the Northwest Company, which sought to expand its own influence. The canoe played a central role in these disputes, as both companies sought to control the best waterways and the most advantageous locations for trading posts. But the canoe was not just a tool of trade, it was also a tool of diplomacy. The fur traders, often acting as intermediaries, relied on the canoe to build relationships with indigenous peoples. They navigated the rivers, bringing not only goods but also promises of trade, cooperation, and mutual benefit. Yet, the realities of the fur trade were complicated. The relationship between European traders and indigenous peoples was often fraught with tension, exploitation, and unequal power dynamics. The canoe, which had initially brought cultures together, was sometimes used as a symbol of European dominance, as the fur trade's expansion led to the displacement and marginalization of indigenous communities. The fur trade entrepreneurs, operating from their distant offices, may not have fully understood the deep cultural significance of these relationships. For the voyageurs, however, the canoe was not just a business tool. It was a symbol of survival, of the friendships and tensions that shaped the fur trade, and of the power dynamics that played out along the waterways of Canada. It was the canoe that brought people together, but it was also the canoe that carried the weight of colonial ambitions and cultural misunderstandings. As we consider the complexities of the canoe's role in the fur trade, we must ask, how did the fur trade change the waterways of Canada? How did it reshape the relationship between indigenous peoples and European settlers? And how did the canoe symbolize both cooperation and conflict? The canoe, once a simple vessel, became a profound tool of economic, cultural, and political exchange. It was, in many ways, a silent witness to the transformation of Canada. We've seen how the canoe was not just a tool of survival, but a symbol of the broader forces at play in the fur trade. But the story doesn't end here. The decline of the fur trade and the rise of modern transportation began to change the role of the canoe in Canadian life. How did these changes affect the voyageurs, the fur trade entrepreneurs, and the indigenous peoples who had once shared in the benefits of the trade? We will explore how the canoe's legacy has endured and how it continues to shape Canada's identity today. Navigating unseen waters, the role of canoes in the fur trade. As the fur trade began to decline in the late 19th century, largely due to the depletion of beaver populations and the arrival of new transportation methods, the role of the canoe gradually shifted. The rise of railroads, steamships, and other forms of modern transportation made the canoe increasingly obsolete as a practical tool for trade. However, despite this decline, the canoe's legacy lived on in ways that would shape the identity of Canada for generations to come. The canoe had become more than just a means of transport for the voyageurs and fur traders. It had become a symbol of Canadian identity. It represented the spirit of exploration, survival, and adaptability that had defined the fur trade. The waterways that the canoe navigated were no longer just commercial routes. They had become part of the cultural fabric of Canada, representing the natural beauty and vastness of the land. As the country began to establish itself, the canoe became a symbol of the rugged, untamed wilderness that had shaped its early history. In the years following the decline of the fur trade, the canoe found new life as a recreational activity. It became an emblem of Canadian outdoor culture, with people using it to explore the very same rivers and lakes that had once carried fur traders and voyageurs. The canoe transformed from a tool of commerce into a tool of leisure and national pride. It became associated with the wilderness adventures of Canadians who sought to reconnect with their land and heritage. But the canoe's cultural significance was not limited to recreation. It also played a role in the continued relationship between Indigenous peoples and the broader Canadian society. For many Indigenous communities, the canoe had always been an integral part of life, long before the fur trade. It remained a symbol of resilience and cultural survival, a link to the past, and a means of navigating the future. The canoe, once central to the fur trade, had become a shared symbol of Canada's history, one that reflected both the colonial impact of the fur trade and the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples and their traditions. As the Canadian wilderness became more accessible and the fur trade faded into history, the canoe became a bridge between the past and the present. It was a symbol of a bygone era, but it also served as a reminder of the persistence and adaptability that had defined those who came before. The legacy of the canoe lives on today, not just in the history books, but in the waterways and traditions that continue to shape Canada's national identity. Looking back at the role of the canoe in the fur trade, we see how it was more than just a mode of transportation. It was a symbol of the interconnectedness of people, cultures, and the land itself. The canoe carried the hopes, dreams, and struggles of those who relied on it, and it left an indelible mark on the history of Canada. As we consider the transformation of the canoe from a commercial tool to a cultural symbol, we are left with a deeper appreciation for the ways in which simple objects can shape the course of history. In closing, we reflect on how the canoe helped define the fur trade, its impact on the economic, cultural, and political landscape of Canada, and its enduring legacy. The fur trade may have come to an end, but the canoe continues to serve as a symbol of the spirit of the Canadian wilderness and the people who once navigated its unseen waters. The Indigenous guides, unspoken histories of the fur trade collaborators. The fur trade, often romanticized for its adventurous tales of voyageurs and entrepreneurs, carries a deeper, unspoken history, one where Indigenous guides played a vital and often overlooked role. These men and women, who had been navigating the waters of Canada for centuries before the fur trade began, were indispensable to the success of the European fur traders. They knew the land, the waterways, and the rhythms of the wilderness in a way that no European settler could comprehend. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the fur traders was not one of equals, but one shaped by necessity, mutual dependence, and, at times, exploitation. The early fur traders, arriving on the shores of Canada from Europe, were woefully ill-prepared to navigate the vast and unfamiliar wilderness. They had little knowledge of the terrain, the rivers, or the seasonal patterns that dictated travel and trade. Enter the Indigenous guides, people whose understanding of the land had been honed over thousands of years of living in harmony with it. The guides were the ones who showed the fur traders how to travel the rivers, how to survive the winters, and, most importantly, how to build relationships with other Indigenous groups who could supply the much-needed furs. But despite their crucial role in the fur trade, the Indigenous guides often went unrecognized in the historical narrative. They were not the ones whose names appeared in company ledgers or trading post records. Their knowledge was often treated as a commodity, something that could be traded or exploited, but never truly valued in the way that the fur trade entrepreneurs or voyageurs were. The guides, many of whom were from Algonquin, Cree, and other Indigenous groups, provided invaluable insight and expertise, yet their contributions were frequently ignored or downplayed in the broader history of the fur trade. The partnership between the fur traders and Indigenous peoples was complex and multifaceted. While many fur traders and Indigenous groups formed collaborative relationships, there were also instances of tension, misunderstanding, and outright exploitation. The Europeans often underestimated the depth of Indigenous knowledge and instead viewed the guides as simply laborers, tools to assist in their own economic ambitions. Yet the guides' role was far more significant than that. They were not just assisting the traders. They were shaping the very nature of the fur trade itself. The fur trade, as it grew in scale, began to shift power dynamics. Indigenous guides were no longer just traveling companions. They became intermediaries, and in some cases, power brokers who influenced which trading posts were established, which territories were navigated, and which alliances were forged. While many Indigenous guides worked with the fur traders out of necessity or pragmatism, others saw the trade as an opportunity to leverage their position and gain access to European goods. Yet this exchange was rarely an equal one, as the Europeans were often more interested in furs and trade routes than in acknowledging the complex cultures and societies of the people they relied on. As we look at the Indigenous guides' role in the fur trade, we must ask, how did their contributions shape the economic success of the fur trade? How did their knowledge influence the relationships between different Indigenous groups and the fur trade companies? And what was the true cost of this collaboration? What were the long-term impacts on Indigenous communities, both in terms of the fur trade's economic benefits and its cultural consequences? we've begun to uncover the untold stories of the indigenous guides, individuals whose knowledge was instrumental in the fur trade, but whose contributions were often overshadowed by the grand narratives of European exploration and economic success. We will explore the complexities of the relationship between indigenous guides and the fur traders, and how these relationships helped shape both the fur trade and the broader history of Canada. The indigenous guides, unspoken histories of the fur trade collaborators. As the fur trade expanded, so too did the role of indigenous guides. They were not just companions on journeys, they were experts who knew how to read the land, the water, and the sky. Their ability to navigate through dense forests, fast-moving rivers, and vast, remote regions was unmatched. The fur traders, with all their European expertise in business and commerce, depended heavily on these guides to survive and thrive in the wilds of Canada. Yet, despite the indispensable role these guides played in the fur trade, their position was often taken for granted. The guides' knowledge of the natural world was invaluable. They knew how to find fresh water, where to hunt, which plants were medicinal, and how to predict the weather. They understood the seasonal migrations of animals, a vital piece of information that helped the traders plan their trips and determine where to trap furs. For the indigenous guides, this knowledge was passed down through generations, and it was closely tied to their cultural practices and spiritual beliefs. It was not just survival knowledge, it was part of their identity, something that connected them to the land and to their ancestors. But as the fur trade took hold and grew in scale, these guides became pawns in a much larger economic game. The fur companies, like the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, grew more powerful, and with that power came the ability to manipulate the relationships between the fur traders and indigenous peoples. The guides, who once held great authority and influence in their communities, found themselves caught between two worlds, one where they were still part of their cultural traditions, and the other where they were being drawn into the economic and political machinations of the fur trade. The relationship between the fur traders and the indigenous guides was often mutually beneficial, but it was not without tension. The fur traders relied on the guides for their expertise, but they also had a tendency to view indigenous peoples as subordinates, seeing them primarily as labor. The guides, on the other hand, were aware of their value and often negotiated for better terms, whether in the form of European goods or a greater role in decision-making. In some instances, guides were able to leverage their knowledge and influence to gain advantages for their communities, trading furs for goods that could improve their standard of living. However, the fur trade also had a darker side for the indigenous guides. As the demand for furs grew and competition between the fur companies intensified, the guides were often caught in the crossfire. The once harmonious relationships between different indigenous groups and the fur traders began to fray, as trading posts moved into new territories, disrupting existing power structures. The fur trade companies, in their efforts to gain control of the most profitable territories, sometimes incited conflict between indigenous groups, and the guides, who had once navigated these relationships with care, were often forced to choose sides. But the power dynamics of the fur trade were not limited to just economic and territorial competition. The arrival of European diseases, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, devastated indigenous populations. Many guides and their families suffered from these diseases, which they had no immunity to. As indigenous communities were decimated, the fur traders lost a vital part of their workforce. The collapse of indigenous populations had far-reaching consequences, both for the fur trade and for the indigenous peoples themselves. Section 2. We've seen how the role of indigenous guides evolved as the fur trade expanded. While they were essential to the fur trade's success, they were often treated as expendable. Their knowledge was vital to the survival of the fur traders, yet their contributions were frequently overlooked or undervalued in the historical narrative. These guides played a crucial role in shaping the fur trade's economic and political landscape, but the long-term impact of their involvement came at a significant cost. We will explore the lasting legacy of the indigenous guides. How did their involvement in the fur trade shape their communities? What happened to their knowledge and cultural practices as the fur trade declined, and their relationships with European traders came to an end? And most importantly, how did the fur trade and its economic systems affect the future of indigenous peoples and their relationship to the land? The indigenous guides, unspoken histories of the fur trade collaborators. As the fur trade faded into history with the decline of the beaver populations and the shift toward other economic systems, the role of indigenous guides in the trade also began to diminish. Yet, their legacy endured in the Canadian landscape, not only in the land they helped navigate, but in the stories of resilience, survival, and cultural exchange they left behind. The collapse of the fur trade in the mid-19th century marked a significant turning point for indigenous peoples. With the cessation of the trade, many communities saw their traditional role in the economy disappear, leaving behind a vacuum that was filled by new economic forces. European settlers, with their new technologies, laws, and industries, began to dominate the landscape, gradually pushing indigenous communities further to the margins. The once valued knowledge of the land, passed down through generations, was no longer seen as vital in the same way it had been during the fur trade. For the guides, this shift was both an economic loss and a cultural one. The skills that had been crucial to their survival during the fur trade were no longer in demand, and many indigenous peoples found themselves navigating a world that was rapidly changing. As settlers moved in, they encroached on the land that indigenous peoples had used for centuries, disrupting not only their way of life, but also the knowledge systems that had been integral to their existence. Despite this, the legacy of the indigenous guides persisted. The fur trade may have ended, but the knowledge they shared about the land, the rivers, and the forests of Canada remained valuable. It would be passed down, not only through family lines, but also in the form of the stories, the language, and the teachings that endured in indigenous communities. These guides had helped create a nation, shaping the economic development of Canada, and their legacy is felt today in the preservation of traditional knowledge and practices. Furthermore, the relationships between indigenous peoples and Europeans during the fur trade had left a complicated but enduring legacy of cultural exchange. While many aspects of this relationship were marred by exploitation and power imbalances, there were also moments of true collaboration and mutual respect. The knowledge of the land that indigenous peoples had shared with the fur traders helped shape the economic and physical infrastructure of Canada. And while the fur trade companies often failed to recognize the full value of indigenous contributions, some fur traders acknowledged the importance of their guides and the wisdom they had shared. Yet the impact of the fur trade on indigenous communities was not only cultural, but also deeply political. The fur trade brought with it a shift in power dynamics that affected indigenous governance and autonomy. The alliances formed with fur traders were often shaped by European interests, and as the fur trade waned, so too did the bargaining power of many indigenous groups. The disruption of traditional economies, coupled with the introduction of European diseases and colonial policies, left many indigenous communities struggling to maintain their land, their culture, and their way of life. As we conclude the story of the indigenous guides, we are left with a profound understanding of their role in the fur trade. Their contributions were integral to the success of the fur trade, yet their recognition in history has often been overshadowed by the grand narratives of European exploration and commerce. The guides were the unsung heroes of the fur trade, their knowledge and expertise crucial to the survival of the trade and to the shaping of the Canadian landscape. Their legacy lives on today, not just in the history books, but in the resilience of indigenous communities, the land they helped map, and the cultural traditions they preserved. Their story is a reminder that history is often written by those who hold power, But the true impact of a people is not always reflected in the pages of official records. The indigenous guides of the fur trade may not have been recognized in the way they deserved, but their contributions are woven into the very fabric of Canada's history. And as we look to the future, we must ask, how can we ensure that the contributions of Indigenous peoples are remembered and respected in the same way that other aspects of Canada's history are celebrated? Tales from the Trading Posts, Daily Life of a Fur Trader in 19th Century Canada. The fur trade was not just about the grand voyages, the dramatic paddle strokes, or the clash of companies. It was also about the everyday lives of those who worked in the trading posts, managing the business that fueled the economy of Canada. The men and women who lived in these remote outposts were the backbone of the fur trade, working tirelessly to ensure that the goods flowed, the furs were traded, and the business continued to thrive. Life at a trading post in 19th century Canada was tough, monotonous, and filled with a constant sense of isolation. These posts were often located far from any major towns or cities, nestled deep within the wilderness. The traders who manned these posts were responsible for a variety of tasks, from overseeing trade negotiations to managing supplies, and sometimes even acting as mediators between indigenous groups and fur companies. The environment was harsh, with long, cold winters and short, intense summers. Despite the challenges, these posts became bustling hubs of activity, where goods were exchanged, deals were struck, and relationships were forged. One of the most important roles at the trading posts was that of the clerk or the factor, the men who ran the day-to-day operations. These individuals were often the only ones with direct contact with the fur trade companies, and their decisions were critical to the success or failure of the post. The clerks managed inventories, organized the logistics of trade, and worked closely with indigenous trappers and traders to ensure that the necessary supplies like firearms, blankets, and tools were available for barter. They also helped maintain records of trades, often in the form of intricate ledgers that tracked the exchange of goods and furs. Despite the authority they held, the daily life of these fur traders was not glamorous. The posts were often basic structures made from logs and other local materials, providing little comfort. Living conditions were cramped, and the traders spent much of their time managing the logistics of running a post or negotiating with indigenous groups. It was a solitary life, with little to no social contact with people outside of the trading network. Many fur traders spent months or even years at a time away from their families, enduring isolation that often led to mental and emotional exhaustion. But despite the hardships, the trading posts were also places of cultural exchange. It was at these posts that many European traders came into direct contact with indigenous peoples, trading goods, sharing stories, and forming bonds that were essential to the fur trade's success. The posts became centers where diverse cultures met, and where the fur trade companies learned the intricacies of indigenous knowledge, including survival techniques, food sources, and strategies for trapping. These interactions were crucial for the survival of the fur trade, and the relationships formed at the trading posts were often long-lasting. The fur trader's daily routine was marked by repetition, but it was a life governed by survival and pragmatism. For many, the ultimate goal was not just the completion of a trade, but the ability to endure in an environment that constantly tested their resilience. However, the fur trade was not just about surviving. There was also a constant tension between the traders' desire for profit and the reality of the land they were working in. The furs they collected were valuable, but the land itself was harsh and unforgiving. Every transaction, every trade, and every negotiation at the trading post was a calculated risk. We've begun to uncover the everyday realities of life at the fur trading posts. The lives of these fur traders, often overlooked in the grand narrative of exploration and adventure, were shaped by the rhythm of the seasons, the demands of trade, and the isolation of their posts. As we move into Section 2, we will delve deeper into the dynamics of life at the posts, how the traders coped with isolation, managed relationships with indigenous groups, and balanced their roles as business people with the cultural exchanges that were taking place. Tales from the Trading Posts, Daily Life of a Fur Trader in 19th Century Canada. As the fur trade continued to grow, the fur trading posts became more than just outposts in the wilderness. They evolved into the lifeblood of the entire operation. These posts were where the economic heart of the fur trade beat, and managing them required a unique set of skills, balancing business, diplomacy, survival, and often cultural sensitivity. The fur traders who manned these posts, known as clerks or factors, were responsible not just for the trade, but also for maintaining a delicate balance between the indigenous groups and the European fur trade companies. They had to be astute businessmen, skilled negotiators, and sometimes even diplomats. The traders' ability to foster positive relationships with the indigenous peoples, who provided the furs and often acted as intermediaries, was crucial to the success of the fur trade. The daily work at the trading post was a mix of business, routine maintenance, and social interaction. Every day, the clerks and their assistants would oversee the exchange of goods, ensuring that both sides were satisfied with the terms of trade. The indigenous trappers would bring in their furs, which were then weighed, valued, and recorded. In return, the clerks would offer goods that the indigenous peoples wanted, trade items such as blankets, firearms, tools, beads, and alcohol, which were highly sought after. Yet, despite the apparent simplicity of the trade, there was a constant undercurrent of tension. The European traders often took advantage of their superior position, offering goods that were not necessarily valuable in indigenous societies, but were deemed essential by the fur companies. The traders understood that their economic success depended on maintaining a steady flow of furs, so they would push to make deals that ensured the longevity of their posts. In doing so, they sometimes disregarded the cultural importance of the goods they offered, viewing the relationship as transactional rather than reciprocal. However, the indigenous guides and traders were no strangers to the fur trade game. They had their own strategies, leveraging their knowledge of the land and their relationships with other indigenous groups to negotiate better deals. In fact, the fur trade was often as much about social capital as it was about goods. The traders knew that the respect they gained in the community, the trust they built with indigenous groups, and the alliances they formed could often be more valuable than the furs themselves. Aside from business dealings, life at the trading posts was dominated by the daily routines of survival. The posts were remote, and the winter months were particularly grueling. Traders and their staff had to be resourceful. The posts were often self-sustaining, with food supplies like dried meats, preserved fish, and salted pork brought in during the warmer months, enough to last through the harsh winters. The posts were small communities, and the traders relied on each other for support and camaraderie. Despite the isolation, there were small moments of connection, whether it was sharing a meal, celebrating a successful trade, or gathering around the fire to tell stories of the outside world. For the clerks and their assistants, life in the trading post could be lonely and monotonous. While some posts were close to indigenous villages, others were remote, isolated from any larger population centers. In these posts, traders would go months without seeing anyone but their fellow workers and the indigenous people they traded with. The isolation could take a toll, and many traders struggled with the mental and emotional exhaustion that came with such isolation. In the long, dark winters, it was not just the cold and the work that wore down the spirits, but the crushing solitude. But despite these challenges, the traders found ways to cope. For some, the routines of the posts became a comfort. The predictability of the work, the rhythms of trade, maintenance, and survival created a sense of purpose. Others found solace in the occasional visits from other posts or trading companies when news from the outside world arrived. It was in these moments, when new goods, letters, or people arrived, that life in the post seemed to come alive again. We begin to understand that life at the trading posts was far from the glamorous adventure often portrayed in popular media. The traders were not only businessmen, they were survivalists, diplomats, and sometimes prisoners of their own isolation. The relationships they forged, both with indigenous groups and with each other, were key to the success of the fur trade. But as we continue into Section 3, we must ask, how did these posts evolve as the fur trade began to decline? What happened to the fur traders, who once held such an important role in shaping Canada's economy? Tales from the Trading Posts, Daily Life of a Fur Trader in 19th Century Canada. As the fur trade began to decline in the late 19th century, the once bustling trading posts that had played such a central role in Canada's economic foundation started to fade into obscurity. The depletion of beaver populations, the rise of modern transportation systems, and the changing economic landscape of Canada all contributed to the decline of the fur trade. With the end of the fur trade's golden age came the end of the small, remote outposts that had once been the lifeblood of Canada's economy. As the fur trade companies lost their dominance, the role of the fur traders themselves changed. Many of the clerks and factors who had once run the posts found themselves without work or were reassigned to other roles within the companies. Some traders, having spent decades in the isolated wilderness, were left to find new paths, often with little more than the experience and skills they had developed in the fur trade. The trading posts, once thriving hubs of activity, became abandoned and decayed as the fur trade companies consolidated their operations and moved their focus elsewhere. Yet, for all the decline of the fur trade, the legacy of the trading posts and the fur traders who ran them remained. The economic networks that had been established by the fur trade did not vanish overnight. The infrastructure, the forts, the waterways, the routes, remained part of Canada's fabric, even as the fur trade's significance dwindled. Many of the trading posts, though abandoned, left behind a cultural and historical mark on the land. The forts became historical sites, visited by those seeking to understand the early history of Canada's development. The decline of the fur trade also marked a shift in the relationships between the fur traders and indigenous peoples. As the demand for furs faded, many indigenous communities found themselves caught in the wake of the fur trade's collapse. The economic systems that had once been so interdependent between indigenous groups and European traders began to unravel. Some indigenous groups turned to farming, others adapted to new forms of trade, while some sought alliances with emerging industries like mining or logging. The fur traders, meanwhile, moved on, but the lessons of the fur trade did not go unnoticed. The fur trade's influence on Canada's development was significant, shaping the country's early economic foundations and its relationship with the land. The legacy of the trading posts and their once vibrant communities shaped not just Canada's economy, but also its identity. The interactions between European settlers and Indigenous peoples at these posts influenced Canadian society in ways that are still felt today. From the cultural exchanges to the tensions that arose from the fur trade's expansion. Despite the end of the fur trade, the history of the traders and the trading posts continues to serve as a reminder of the role that individuals, communities, and businesses play in shaping the course of a nation's development. The fur traders may have lived in isolation, but their influence was felt far beyond the walls of their remote outposts. Their work, their struggles, and their ability to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth left an indelible mark on the history of Canada. In closing, we reflect on the complexities of life at the trading posts and the far-reaching impact of the fur trade. Though the fur trade's heyday is long gone, the stories of those who lived and worked in the posts remain a testament to the resilience, adaptability, and perseverance required to thrive in a world defined by trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. The fur traders, in their quiet yet powerful way, helped lay the foundations for the Canada we know today, and their legacy endures in the land they helped shape. The long wait wintering over in remote posts without modern comforts. In the harsh, remote outposts of the fur trade, winter wasn't just a season, It was a test of endurance, survival, and patience. As the seasons changed and the rivers froze, the fur traders were left to endure months of isolation and deprivation. For them, the long Canadian winters were not a mere inconvenience. They were a defining part of their lives. Wintering over in these outposts meant enduring not just the cold, but the physical and mental toll of being cut off from the outside world for months on end. The fur trade posts, typically located in the most inaccessible parts of Canada, were designed to withstand the brutal cold of the winters. The traders would seal themselves off from the rest of the world as soon as the rivers froze and travel became impossible. Their only connection to the outside world was the rare passing of a trader or a supply run, but these occurrences were few and far between. The isolation was total, and for those stationed in remote trading posts, winter was a time of endurance. The physical environment alone made wintering over in these posts a formidable challenge. The freezing temperatures, which could drop well below degrees C, were a constant threat. Buildings were constructed to keep out the cold, but they were not immune to it. The warmth of a campfire or stove was often the only respite from the relentless chill. The fur traders spent hours chopping wood and stoking fires just to maintain some semblance of warmth. Every day was a battle against the cold, and every night was filled with the eerie silence of a frozen world. Food supplies, too, were limited during these months. Fresh provisions were long gone by the time winter set in, and traders subsisted on dried meats, salted fish, and hard biscuits. The food was often monotonous, lacking variety or nutrients, which made the traders vulnerable to scurvy and other illnesses. The long winters also presented a challenge in terms of food preparation. With little access to fresh water, melting snow became a primary source for drinking water, but it was often contaminated by dirt or other impurities, increasing the risk of illness. Beyond the physical hardships, the mental toll of wintering over in these isolated posts was perhaps even more taxing. The traders faced long, dark nights with little distraction or entertainment. They often found themselves alone for days or weeks at a time, with no company other than their fellow traders. The monotony of the daily routines and the lack of social interaction could lead to depression and homesickness. For many traders, the isolation was unbearable, and the desire to leave the post for even a brief respite was constant. Despite these challenges, the traders found ways to cope with the long winters. They relied on their camaraderie to make the days pass. The trading posts became small communities, and social gatherings, though sparse, became a source of comfort. Storytelling, games, and simple pleasures like playing cards helped alleviate the monotony. These social interactions, however simple, played a vital role in maintaining the mental well-being of the fur traders, helping them endure the harsh conditions of the winter months. As we consider the trials of wintering over in these remote posts, we must ask, what did the isolation do to the fur traders' sense of self and purpose? How did their ability to survive in such extreme conditions shape their view of the world? And how did their relationships with one another evolve over the long, cold months spent together? The long wait wintering over in remote posts without modern comforts. The isolation of the winter months in the fur trade posts brought with it an emotional and psychological strain that was as difficult to endure as the physical hardships. While the traders had no choice but to endure the cold and the scarcity of resources, it was the profound solitude that became their most formidable enemy. The lack of external contact, the long, dark nights, and the repetitive, monotonous routines slowly began to wear on their spirits. Many traders found themselves drifting into a kind of mental fatigue, struggling with homesickness, and occasionally descending into depression. One of the few coping mechanisms for the traders was the camaraderie they shared with one another. This sense of brotherhood, forged in the hardships of winter, helped to keep morale high, even in the most isolating conditions. Though they were far from their families, the traders relied heavily on their fellow workers to stay sane and focused. They told stories around the fire, shared dreams of warmer days, and laughed together to stave off the creeping loneliness. But as the winter wore on, even this sense of companionship could not entirely combat the mental toll of constant isolation. Another coping mechanism was the rhythm of daily chores and responsibilities that kept the traders occupied and provided them with a sense of purpose. The work was unrelenting, with tasks ranging from maintaining the post, fixing equipment, and hunting to melting snow for drinking water. Though these tasks were difficult and tiring, they served to structure the days and keep the traders active. Without them, time might have stood still in the deep cold, making the mental and physical toll even more unbearable. However, the hard work and collective spirit that helped the traders get through the winter also led to new challenges. The close quarters and constant interaction could result in friction, especially after months of isolation. Small disputes could easily escalate in the confined environment of the post, where personal space and privacy were virtually non-existent. The traders' relationships were crucial to their survival, but the long, stressful winters sometimes put those relationships to the test. Despite the physical and emotional strain, many fur traders grew resilient during their time wintering over. The necessity of survival in such a harsh environment meant that they had no choice but to adapt. The mental toughness they developed through prolonged isolation became a cornerstone of their identity. They learned to make do with less, to live without luxuries, and to find joy in the smallest of things: a shared meal, a moment of laughter, or the light of a campfire. We will look at how the traders' resilience affected their relationships with the land and with the indigenous groups they interacted with. How did their prolonged isolation shape their view of the fur trade and their roles within it? And most importantly, how did these winters change them, both as individuals and as part of a larger, interconnected fur trade system? The answers to these questions will reveal the lasting impact that this life of isolation and survival had on the fur traders, and the wider legacy of the fur trade itself. The long wait wintering over in remote posts without modern comforts. As the fur trade continued to evolve and eventually decline, the once essential trading posts and the traders who lived within them began to fade into history. The long, grueling winters, which had defined the lives of these traders for so many years, began to lose their importance as new methods of transportation and communication supplanted the fur trade's old systems. But the time spent in these isolated posts, and the mental and physical toll that came with surviving the winter months, left an indelible mark on those who lived through it. For many fur traders, the winters spent alone at remote posts were the ultimate test of resilience. The hardships they endured shaped their character in profound ways, and they became known for their toughness, their ability to endure, and their relentless pursuit of survival. These were qualities that would follow them throughout their lives, even after the fur trade had faded from importance. Many of the traders who spent their lives in these posts carried the memories of their winters with them, even in times of peace and prosperity. But the long isolation also had its costs. The psychological toll of wintering over was not something that could be easily shaken off. Many traders who had spent years in the wilderness returned to more populated areas only to struggle with reintegrating into society. The isolation, which had been a way of life for so long, had created deep mental scars for some. The withdrawal from the tightly knit communities of the fur trade posts made it difficult for them to adjust to the hustle and bustle of city life, and some traders found themselves missing the solitude of the wilderness. The emotional toll was not easily measured, and the psychological strain of the winters lingered long after the fur trade was gone. For indigenous peoples, the decline of the fur trade marked a dramatic shift in their relationship with European settlers. The traders who had spent so much time in isolation and who had relied heavily on indigenous knowledge began to fade from the scene, but their influence remained. The loss of the fur trade meant the loss of the complex economic networks that had been built over centuries. The reliance on indigenous expertise, while it had brought benefits to the fur traders, had also led to cultural disintegration and exploitation. Many indigenous groups had become economically dependent on the fur trade, and as it disappeared, they were forced to adapt once again. Yet, in the larger scope of Canadian history, the fur traders' winters in isolation became symbolic of the endurance and adaptability of the people who built the country. Their survival during the harsh winters and their ability to persist in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges became the foundation for a national identity rooted in resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to change. Though the fur trade was no longer the driving force behind the economy, the spirit of those traders, who had endured so much in the isolation of their posts, continued to resonate in the broader cultural fabric of Canada. Today, we reflect on the legacy of the fur traders, not just in terms of economic exchange, but in terms of their role in shaping the character of the Canadian people. The winters they spent isolated in remote posts were the crucible in which many of Canada's founding qualities were forged. The lessons of perseverance, mental strength, and survival in the face of adversity still echo in the nation's identity. The fur traders' time spent wintering over in remote posts may seem like a small chapter in the grand narrative of Canada's history, but it was a defining one. It was in those long, cold months of isolation that the true character of these traders was revealed. They were more than just traders. They were survivors, builders, and, in their own way, pioneers who played an integral role in the shaping of the land and the people that would become Canada.